Before you turn away, imagine this: a whole town, once full of life, slowly falling silent as every man, woman, and child refuses to eat, believing that hunger is the path to eternal life. Imagine empty streets, locked doors, and the sound of prayers whispered by starving voices. Now imagine that when the world finally noticed, it was too late. Only a single diary remained, its pages filled with secrets, warnings, and the final words of a lost community. This isn't just a story about a cult. It's about the power of belief, the danger of silence, and the question that still haunts the ruins. What really happened in the town that starved itself? Listen closely, because the truth behind the 1873 fasting cult is more chilling and more mysterious than anyone ever dared to believe. The arrival of the prophet. Before the world forgot Mill Hollow, it was just another quiet village tucked between the hills and the river, a place where the days were measured by the sun and the seasons, and the nights by the sound of crickets and the distant howl of wolves. In 1873, the people of Mill Hollow believed in hard work, in family, and in the comfort of familiar faces. They believed in the church, in the wisdom of their elders, and in the promise that if you did right by your neighbor, the world would do right by you. But that spring, something changed. It began with a stranger. He arrived on a Sunday, just as the church bells were ringing. He walked into town with nothing but a walking stick and a small leather satchel. His name, he said, was Elijah Crane. He was tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to look right through you, and a voice that was soft but carried like thunder. He wore a plain black coat, dusty from the road, and his hair was the color of ash. No one saw where he came from. Some said he'd walked out of the woods. Others whispered that he'd come down the river, following the current like a ghost. But everyone remembered the way he stood in the center of the square, waiting for someone to speak to him. It was Abigail Turner, the widow who ran the boarding house, who first broke the silence. She was a practical woman, not given to superstition, but something about the stranger made her uneasy. Still, she offered him a room and a meal, as was the custom in Mill Hollow. He thanked her, his eyes kind but distant. "I do not eat much," he said. "Hunger is a gift, not a curse." Abigail wrote about him that night in her diary, and the only place she ever confessed her fears. "He speaks of hunger as a blessing. He says the flesh is a prison, and only by denying it can we be free. I do not know if I believe him, but I am afraid to turn him away. There is something in his eyes that makes me think of winter, of long nights and empty cupboards." The first sermon. Elijah Crane did not force his beliefs on anyone. He simply waited. He sat on the porch of the boarding house, reading from a battered Bible, and people came to him. At first it was just the curious, children who wanted to hear stories, old men who wanted to argue about Scripture, women who brought him bread and soup, which he always refused. He spoke gently, never raising his voice. He told them about saints who had fasted for 40 days and nights, about prophets who had wandered the desert with nothing but faith. He spoke of a world beyond this one, a place where hunger was the key to immortality. "Food is a chain," he said. "It binds us to the earth, to pain, to death. But if we let go of hunger, if we embrace the emptiness, we can be free. We can live forever." Some laughed at him. Others listened, their eyes wide with wonder or fear. The town's pastor, Reverend Harlan, was the first to speak out against Elijah. He warned his congregation to beware of false prophets, to trust in the teachings they had always known. But Elijah never argued. He simply smiled and said, "The truth does not need to shout." The first followers. It was the hungry who came to Elijah first, the poor, the sick, the lonely, people who had lost children to fever, who had watched crops fail and animals die, people who knew what it was to be empty. He listened to their stories, held their hands, and told them that their suffering was not a punishment, but a path. Hunger is the door, he said. If you walk through it, you will find peace. Abigail watched as more and more people came to the boarding house. She wrote in her diary, "He has a way of making you believe that pain is holy, that every empty stomach is a prayer. I see the way people look at him as if he can save them from something they cannot name." By midsummer, Elijah had a small group of followers. They met in secret, fasting for days at a time, praying for visions. They stopped planting their fields, stopped tending their animals, stopped coming to church. The laughter faded from the streets, replaced by the sound of whispered prayers and rumbling stomachs. Children grew thin and pale. Women fainted in the market. Men argued in hushed voices about what to do. Reverend Harlan tried to intervene, but his words fell on deaf ears. "They are lost," he told his wife. "They have forgotten the difference between faith and madness." The diary of Abigail Turner. Abigail's diary became her only confidant. She wrote of her doubts, her fears, and the strange peace that settled over the town as more and more people joined Elijah's fast. "We are hungry, but we are not afraid," she wrote. "He says we are chosen. He says we will never die." But as the days grew shorter and the harvest failed, hunger turned to desperation. The children cried at night, their bellies empty. The old and the weak began to die. Abigail wrote, "I hear them at night, praying for the hunger to end. But Elijah says we must hold fast, that the world is about to change. I do not know if I believe him, but I am too weak to argue." The town changes. By autumn, Mill Hollow was a different place. The fields were overgrown, the wells ran dry, and the church bells rang only for funerals. The few who resisted Elijah's teachings were shunned, their homes marked with stones. Some left town, but most stayed, too afraid or too hopeful to leave. Elijah moved into the old parsonage, abandoned by Reverend Harlan when he could no longer bear to watch his flock starve. The prophet's followers called him Father Elijah now, and they brought him gifts, flowers, letters, sometimes even their own children, asking for blessings. He accepted everything with a gentle smile, but he never ate. Abigail watched him grow thinner, his eyes brighter, his voice softer but more powerful than ever. "He is like a flame," she wrote, "beautiful but dangerous. I am afraid of what will happen when he burns out." A village of ghosts. As winter approached, the town grew quieter. The snow fell early, covering the empty fields and silent streets. The only footprints were those of Elijah's followers moving from house to house, checking on the sick and the dying. Abigail's diary became more desperate. "I am so hungry I can barely write. My hands shake. My vision blurs. But Elijah says we are close, that soon we will be free." She wrote of dreams, strange, vivid dreams of a world without hunger, where the dead walked among the living, smiling and whole. But when she woke, the world was cold and gray, and the hunger was worse than ever. The last sermon. On the first day of December, Elijah called the town together in the square. He stood on the steps of the old church, his voice barely more than a whisper, but everyone heard him. "The time has come," he said. "You have suffered. You have sacrificed. Now you will be rewarded. The flesh is weak, but the spirit is eternal. Let go of your hunger, and you will live forever." Some wept with joy, others wept with fear. Abigail wrote, "I do not know if I believe him, but I am too tired to fight. I pray that he is right. I pray that this will end." A town disappears. In the weeks that followed, Mill Hollow faded from the world. Travelers who passed through found empty houses, cold hearths, and silence. The few who survived were too weak to speak, their eyes hollow, their bodies wasted. When the authorities finally arrived in the spring, they found only one survivor, Abigail Turner, barely alive, clutching her diary. The rest of the town was gone. The diary survives. Abigail's diary was passed from hand to hand, read by doctors, priests, and scholars. Some called it a warning, others called it a confession. But no one could explain what had happened in Mill Hollow. The last entry read, "I am so hungry, but I am not afraid. I see them in my dreams, walking in the fields, smiling. Elijah is with them. He says we are free. I hope he is right." But as the world tries to make sense of Mill Hollow's fate, a single act of defiance, hidden in the pages of Abigail's diary, will reveal the first crack in the cult's grip. What happens when one person dares to question the prophet? The next chapter will reveal the secret that could have saved them all. Stay with me, the first doubter. The winter of 1873 was the coldest anyone in Mill Hollow could remember. The snow came early and heavy, blanketing the fields and roads, muffling every sound. The world outside the village seemed to disappear, leaving only the wind and the endless gray sky. Inside their homes, the people of Mill Hollow huddled together, hungry and weak, clinging to the hope that Elijah Crane's promise would soon be fulfilled. But not everyone believed. Abigail Turner's diary, the only surviving record of those months, tells us that the first seeds of doubt were sown by a man named Samuel Price. Samuel was a blacksmith, a big man with rough hands and a booming laugh. He had never been a religious man, but he loved his wife and children fiercely, and he had joined Elijah's followers out of desperation, not faith. At first, Samuel tried to believe. He fasted with the others, prayed with the others, and listened to Elijah's sermons with a mixture of hope and fear. But as the weeks passed and the hunger grew, Samuel began to question. A father's doubt. Abigail wrote, "Samuel Price came to me today. He looked thinner than I have ever seen him, his eyes sunken, his hands shaking. He asked if I had any food, just a crust of bread for his youngest boy. I told him I had nothing, and he wept. He said he did not understand why God would want children to starve. I had no answer." Samuel's doubt was a dangerous thing, in a town where everyone watched everyone else, where every empty plate was a sign of faith. Questioning Elijah's teachings was almost unthinkable. But Samuel could not help himself. He saw his children growing weaker every day, their faces pale, their eyes too big for their thin faces. He saw his wife, Mary, trying to hide her tears as she tucked the children into bed with empty stomachs. One night after the children were asleep, Samuel turned to Mary. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I can't watch them die." Mary shushed him, glancing at the window. "Don't say that, Sam. Someone might hear." "I don't care," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "This isn't right. Hunger isn't holy. It's killing us." Mary shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Elijah says we're close. He says the suffering will end soon." Samuel looked at her, his heart breaking. And what if he's wrong? A dangerous secret. Samuel's doubt was not as secret as he thought. In Mill Hollow, rumors spread faster than fire. It wasn't long before one of Elijah's most devoted followers, a woman named Ruth Collins, heard Samuel's words. Ruth was a true believer. She had lost her husband to fever the year before, and Elijah's promise of immortality was the only thing that kept her going. She watched her neighbors closely, reporting any sign of weakness or doubt to Elijah. Abigail wrote, "Ruth Collins came to the boarding house today. She asked if I had seen Samuel Price. She said he was spreading doubt, that he was endangering the whole town. I told her I had not seen him, but I could see the suspicion in her eyes. That night, Elijah called a meeting in the old church. The townspeople gathered, their faces gaunt, their bodies wrapped in blankets. Elijah stood at the front, his eyes burning with a strange light. "There are those among us who doubt," he said, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "There are those who would turn away from the path, who would lead others astray. We must be strong. We must be faithful. The end is near." He did not name Samuel, but everyone knew. A secret meal. Samuel could not bear to see his children suffer any longer. One night he slipped out of the house and made his way to the old barn at the edge of town. There, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he had stashed a small sack of potatoes and a jar of honey, leftovers from the last harvest, saved for just such a moment. He built a small fire, boiled the potatoes, and ate in silence, tears streaming down his face. He felt guilty, ashamed, but also alive for the first time in weeks. He brought a few potatoes home for Mary and the children, telling them to eat quickly and quietly. "Don't tell anyone," he whispered. "This is just for us." Mary hesitated, but hunger won out. She fed the children, watching as color returned to their cheeks. For a few days, Samuel's family grew stronger. But secrets never stayed hidden in Mill Hollow. The price of doubt. Ruth Collins saw Samuel sneaking out at night. She followed him to the barn, watched as he dug up the potatoes, and hurried back to tell Elijah. The next day, Elijah called another meeting. This time his voice was harder, colder. "There is a traitor among us," he said. "Someone who has turned away from the path, who has chosen the flesh over the spirit. This cannot be allowed." He called Samuel to the front of the church. The townspeople watched in silence as Samuel stood before Elijah, his head bowed. "Do you deny it?" Elijah asked. Samuel looked up, his eyes full of pain. "I did what I had to do. My children were starving." Elijah shook his head. "You have endangered us all. The path to immortality is narrow. There is no room for weakness." He turned to the crowd. "What should be done?" Ruth Collins stepped forward. "He must be cast out. He must be made to suffer for his doubt." The crowd murmured in agreement. Elijah nodded. "So be it." Samuel was banished from Mill Hollow, his family forced to stay behind. He left with nothing but the clothes on his back, his heart heavy with guilt and fear. Abigail wrote, "I watched Samuel Price walk down the road, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. I wanted to call out to him to tell him he was right, but I was afraid. I am so hungry. I am so tired. I do not know what is true anymore." The diary's secret. Abigail's diary became more desperate as the winter dragged on. She wrote of her own doubts, her own hunger, her fear that Elijah was leading them to ruin. "I dream of food," she wrote. "I dream of bread and honey, of warm soup and sweet apples. But when I wake, there is nothing. Elijah says we are close, but I do not know if I believe him. I am afraid to speak, afraid to hope." One night, Abigail found a note slipped under her door. It was from Samuel. "You are not alone," it read. "There are others who doubt. If you can, meet me at the old barn tomorrow night." Abigail hesitated, torn between fear and hope. She knew the risk. If she was caught, she would be banished or worse. But the hunger was unbearable, and the thought of seeing Samuel, of finding someone who understood, was too tempting to resist. A meeting in the dark. That night, Abigail wrapped herself in a shawl and slipped out of the boarding house. The snow was deep, the wind biting, but she made her way to the barn. Samuel was waiting, his face gaunt but his eyes alive. "There are others," he whispered. a few of us who can't do it anymore. We meet here, share what little food we have. We talk about leaving, about starting over somewhere else. Abigail felt a surge of hope and fear. "Why don't you leave?" she asked. Samuel shook his head. "My family. I can't leave them behind. And Elijah, he has too much power. People are afraid." They sat in silence, sharing a crust of bread and a few sips of water. "Write it down," Samuel said. "Write everything. If something happens to us, the world needs to know." Abigail nodded, her resolve hardening. The first crack. The next day, Abigail wrote in her diary, "There is a crack in the cult's grip. Not everyone believes. Not everyone is willing to die for Elijah's promise. I do not know what will happen, but I will keep writing. I will not let our story be forgotten." As the days passed, more people joined Samuel in secret. They shared food, whispered doubts, and dreamed of escape. But Elijah was watching. He sensed the change, the shift in the air. His sermons grew harsher, his punishments more severe. Abigail wrote, "He is afraid. I see it in his eyes. He knows he is losing us. I pray that we are strong enough to break free." A town on the edge. Mill Hollow was a village on the edge, of starvation, of madness, of something no one could name. The snow kept falling, the hunger kept growing, and the people grew more desperate by the day. But in the darkness, a spark of hope had been lit. Abigail's diary, hidden beneath her mattress, became a record of resistance, a testament to the power of doubt, of courage, of the human spirit. And as winter turned to spring, the first cracks in Elijah's cult began to widen. But as the doubters grow bolder, Elijah's grip tightens, and a single act of rebellion will set off a chain of events that no one in Mill Hollow can escape. What happens when faith turns to fear and hope becomes a crime? The next chapter will reveal the moment the town's silence is finally broken. Stay with me. The night the silence broke. The snow in Mill Hollow was beginning to melt, but the cold lingered in the bones of every villager. The hunger was worse than ever. Children's faces were gaunt, and the old men who once played checkers in the square now sat in silence, too weak to move their pieces. The only thing that seemed to grow was the fear. Fear of Elijah, fear of starvation, fear of what would happen if anyone dared to speak out. But in the shadows, the doubters were gathering. Abigail Turner's diary, now a lifeline for her sanity, recorded every whisper, every secret meeting, every flicker of hope. She wrote by candlelight, her hands shaking from hunger, her mind sharp with the knowledge that she was not alone. "We met again tonight," she wrote. "Samuel, Mary, old Mr. Finch, and me. We shared a crust of bread and a few sips of water. We talked about leaving, about taking the children and running for the next town. But the roads are watched, and Elijah's followers are everywhere. Still, the hunger is killing us. We cannot go on like this." The spark of rebellion. It was Samuel Price who first spoke the words that everyone else was afraid to say. "We have to do something," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "If we stay, we die. If we run, we might die. But at least we'll have tried." Mary, her eyes hollow, nodded. "I can't watch the children starve anymore. I'd rather die on the road than in this house." Mr. Finch, who had once been the town's schoolmaster, looked at Abigail. "You're the only one who writes it all down. If something happens to us, you have to make sure the world knows what happened here." Abigail promised she would. They made a plan. At dawn, when Elijah's followers were at their weakest, Samuel and Mary would try to slip out of town with their children. Abigail would create a distraction. something loud enough to draw attention away from the road. It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. The distraction. Abigail spent the night preparing. She gathered every pot and pan in the boarding house, tying them together with string. She found an old bell in the attic, the one that used to call guests to dinner. She waited until the first light of dawn, her heart pounding in her chest. When the time came, she stepped out onto the porch and began to bang the pots together, ringing the bell as loud as she could. The sound echoed through the empty streets, waking the town from its stupor. Windows opened, doors creaked, and Elijah's followers stumbled outside, their faces twisted with confusion and anger. Abigail shouted, "Fire! Fire in the church!" The crowd surged toward the church, leaving the road to the next town unguarded. Samuel and Mary, carrying their children, slipped out the back door of their house and ran for the woods. Abigail watched them go, praying they would make it. Elijah's fury. The distraction worked. At first. But it didn't take long for Elijah to realize what was happening. He stood in the square, his eyes blazing with fury. "Who did this?" he demanded. "Who dares to defy the will of the prophet?" No one answered. The crowd shrank back, afraid. Elijah's gaze fell on Abigail, still standing on the porch, the bell in her hand. "You," he said, his voice cold. "You are the traitor." Abigail's heart raced. She tried to speak, but her mouth was dry. Elijah turned to his followers. "Bring her to the church." They dragged Abigail through the snow, her feet bare, her body trembling. She saw Samuel and Mary disappear into the woods, and she prayed they would not be caught. The trial. The church was cold and dark, the pews filled with Elijah's followers. He stood at the front, his hands raised. "This woman has betrayed us," he said. "She has endangered our souls. What should be done?" Ruth Collins, ever the true believer, stood up. "She must be punished. She must be made an example." Elijah nodded. "So be it." They locked Abigail in the church basement, a small windowless room with a dirt floor. They gave her no food, no water, only her diary and a single candle. "I am alone," she wrote. "I do not know if Samuel and Mary made it. I do not know if I will ever see the sun again. But I am not afraid. I have done what I had to do." A town divided. The escape of Samuel and Mary sent shock waves through Mill Hollow. Some saw them as traitors, others as heroes. Elijah's sermons grew harsher, his punishments more severe. He warned that anyone who tried to leave would be cast out, that only the faithful would survive the coming darkness. But the doubters were no longer silent. They met in secret, sharing what little food they could find, whispering plans for escape. Abigail's act of rebellion had given them hope. "The town is changing," she wrote. "People are afraid, but they are also angry. They see their children dying, their neighbors wasting away. They are starting to question. I pray that it is not too late." The diary's revelation. In the darkness of the church basement, Abigail wrote by the light of her candle. She wrote about the hunger, the fear, the cruelty of Elijah's rule. She wrote about the kindness of her friends, the courage of Samuel and Mary, and the hope that still flickered in her heart. She wrote a message for anyone who might find her diary. "If you are reading this, know that we tried. Know that we were not all believers. Some of us fought, some of us ran, some of us died. But we did not all go willingly into the darkness." A ray of hope. After 3 days, Ruth Collins came to the basement. She brought Abigail a cup of water and a piece of bread. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered. "I didn't know it would be like this. I thought Elijah would save us. But now, I don't know what to believe." Abigail took her hand. "It's not too late, Ruth. We can still save the children. We can still leave." Ruth nodded, tears in her eyes. I'll help you. I'll tell the others. The night of the escape. That night, Ruth unlocked the basement door. Abigail slipped out into the darkness, her body weak, but her spirit strong. She made her way to the old barn, where the doubters were waiting. They moved quickly, gathering the children, the sick, the old. They carried what little food they had, wrapped themselves in blankets, and slipped into the woods. Behind them, the town was silent. Elijah's followers, too weak to stop them, watched from their windows as the rebels disappeared into the night. Abigail wrote, "We are free. We are hungry, but we are free. I do not know what will happen to those who stayed behind. I pray that they will find mercy." A town left behind. When the authorities finally arrived in Mill Hollow, they found a village of ghosts. The houses were empty, the fields overgrown, the church abandoned. The only sign of life was Abigail's diary left on the altar, its pages filled with the story of a town that had starved itself in the name of faith. The survivors, Samuel, Mary, Ruth, Abigail, and a handful of others made their way to the next town. They were taken in, fed, and cared for. Some never spoke of Mill Hollow again. Others told their story to anyone who would listen. Abigail's diary became a warning, a testament to the danger of blind faith and the power of doubt. But as the survivors try to rebuild their lives, the world demands answers, and the truth about Elijah Crane and the fate of Mill Hollow will shock everyone. What happens when the story of a lost town becomes a legend no one can forget? The next chapter will reveal the aftermath, the investigation, and the haunting legacy of the fasting cult. Stay with me. The world looks in. When the first survivors staggered into the neighboring town of Ashford, they were barely recognizable as the people they had once been. Samuel Price, once the strongest man in Mill Hollow, was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his hands shaking as he tried to hold a cup of water. Mary clung to her children, who whimpered in their sleep, waking only to ask for bread. Ruth Collins, who had once been Elijah's most loyal follower, now wept at the sight of a full table, unable to eat more than a few bites. Abigail Turner, clutching her diary, was the last to arrive. She had walked the final miles alone, her feet bleeding, her mind swirling with memories she could not escape. She was taken in by a kind widow who washed her wounds and fed her broth, listening in silence as Abigail tried to explain what had happened in Mill Hollow. The news spread quickly. A whole town vanished. Survivors who spoke of starvation, of a prophet who promised immortality through hunger, of children who died with prayers on their lips. The authorities in Ashford sent word to the county seat, and soon a team of doctors, lawmen, and journalists arrived to investigate. The first investigation. The journey to Mill Hollow was slow. The spring thaw had turned the roads to mud, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and old snow. When the investigators arrived, they found a village frozen in time. Doors hung open, windows were broken, and the only sound was the wind rattling through empty houses. The church was the first place they searched. On the altar, they found Abigail's diary, its pages filled with the cramped handwriting. The lawmen read it aloud, their faces growing pale as they realized the scale of what had happened. "We are hungry, but we are not afraid. He says we are chosen. He says we will never die." The doctors moved from house to house, finding bodies in beds, on floors, in chairs by cold hearths. Some had died holding hands. Others had left notes, prayers, confessions, pleas for forgiveness. The children were the hardest to bear. Some had been buried in shallow graves behind the church, marked only by stones. Others were found in their mother's arms, their faces peaceful, as if they had simply fallen asleep. The investigators took careful notes, drawing maps, collecting letters and interviewing the survivors. They tried to piece together the timeline. When Elijah arrived, when the fasting began, when the first deaths occurred. But the truth was slippery, always just out of reach. The search for Elijah, the one person no one could find, was Elijah Crane. The survivors told conflicting stories. Some said he had died with the others, his body burned in a funeral pyre behind the church. Others claimed he had vanished into the woods, promising to return when the faithful were ready. A few whispered that he had never been real at all, that he was a spirit, a test sent by God. The lawmen searched the woods for days, following footprints that led nowhere, finding only scraps of cloth and the remains of old campfires. They questioned every town for miles, but no one had seen a man matching Elijah's description. Abigail wrote in her diary, "I do not know if he is dead or alive. Sometimes I dream that he is still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes I think he was just a man, lost and hungry like the rest of us. But sometimes when the wind howls at night, I wonder if he was something else. The world reacts." The story of Mill Hollow shocked the nation. Newspapers ran headlines. "The Starving Village. Cult promises immortality, delivers death. Prophet of hunger vanishes after dozens die. Only one diary survives." Reporters flocked to Ashford, eager to interview the survivors. Some were sympathetic, others skeptical. They asked the same questions over and over. Why did you follow him? Why didn't you leave? Didn't you know you were dying? Samuel Price, still weak but growing stronger, tried to explain. "We were desperate," he said. "We wanted to believe there was a reason for our suffering. Elijah gave us hope, even if it was false." Mary, her voice trembling, added, "He made us feel special, like our pain meant something." Ruth Collins, racked with guilt, could only weep. "I thought I was saving my soul. I didn't know I was losing everything else." Abigail, her diary now in the hands of the authorities, struggled to find words. "I wrote it all down," she said, "so no one would forget, so no one would ever do this again." The blame game. As the weeks passed, the search for answers turned into a search for blame. Some pointed fingers at Elijah, calling him a monster, a manipulator, a false prophet. Others blamed the survivors, accusing them of weakness, of madness, of abandoning their neighbors. A few blamed the world outside Mill Hollow, the poverty, the isolation, the lack of help from the county or the church. The lawmen tried to find someone to arrest, but with Elijah gone, there was no one left to punish. The survivors were too broken to fight back, too haunted to defend themselves. The doctors wrote reports describing the effects of starvation, the signs of mass hysteria, the dangers of blind faith. The journalists wrote stories, some true, some exaggerated, all tinged with horror and fascination. But no one could answer the question that haunted everyone who heard the story. How could a whole town starve itself to death? The diary's journey. Abigail's diary became the centerpiece of the investigation. It was published in newspapers, studied by psychologists, and debated by theologians. Some called it a warning, others a confession, others a work of madness. But for Abigail, it was simply the truth. "I wrote it all down," she told a reporter, "because I was afraid I would forget, because I wanted someone to know that we tried, that we were not all believers, that some of us fought, even if we lost." The diary inspired other survivors to write their own stories. Samuel Price kept a journal, describing his escape and the guilt he felt for leaving others behind. Mary wrote letters to her children telling them to never trust anyone who promised salvation through suffering. Ruth Collins, her faith shattered, spent her days tending the graves behind the church, planting flowers and whispering prayers for forgiveness. The haunting legacy. As spring turned to summer, the survivors of Mill Hollow tried to rebuild their lives. Some moved to new towns, changing their names, trying to forget. Others stayed in Ashford, forming a small community of their own, bound by shared loss and the hope that they could start again. But the legacy of the fasting cult lingered. Children who survived grew up with nightmares, afraid of hunger, afraid of faith, afraid of the dark. Parents struggled to explain what had happened, to make sense of the senseless. The ruins of Mill Hollow became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the grieving. People came to see the empty houses, the overgrown fields, the church where Elijah had preached his gospel of hunger. Some left flowers on the graves. Others left notes, prayers, or curses. A few claimed to see Elijah's ghost, wandering the woods at dusk, still searching for followers. A world changed. The story of Mill Hollow changed the way people thought about faith, about community, about the power of belief. Laws were passed to protect vulnerable communities, to regulate religious leaders, to provide aid to the poor and the isolated. Churches preached caution, warning against false prophets and the dangers of blind obedience. Psychologists studied the case, trying to understand how a whole town could fall under the spell of a single man. But for the survivors, the lessons were simpler. Never stop asking questions, Samuel Price told his children. Never let anyone tell you that suffering is holy, and never ever forget what happened here. The final entry. Abigail Turner lived for many years after the fall of Mill Hollow. She never remarried, never left Ashford. She spent her days tending a small garden, writing letters to the families of the lost, and reading her diary by the light of the window. Her last entry, written in a shaky hand, read, "I am old now. The hunger is gone, but the memories remain. I see their faces in my dreams, hear their voices in the wind. I do not know if Elijah was a prophet or a madman. I only know that we were all so hungry for hope, for meaning, for something to believe in. If you are reading this, remember us. Remember that faith without love is just another kind of hunger. Remember Mill Hollow." But as the world tries to move on, the ruins of Mill Hollow refuse to stay silent. A new generation will return to the village, searching for answers, and what they find will change everything we thought we knew about the fasting cult. The next chapter will reveal the secrets still buried in Mill Hollow and the truth that refuses to die. Stay with me. The return to Mill Hollow. Decades passed. The story of Mill Hollow faded from the headlines, but it never disappeared from the memories of those who survived or the nightmares of their children. The world changed. Railroads came, new towns grew, and the old roads to Mill Hollow were slowly swallowed by weeds and trees. But the legend of the fasting cult lingered, whispered in small towns and written in the margins of history books. For the children of the survivors, Mill Hollow was a shadow that stretched across their lives. Some grew up in Ashford, others moved far away, but all carried the weight of what their parents had endured. Some tried to forget. Others, like Ruth Collins' granddaughter Anna, could never let go. Anna was born long after the tragedy, but she grew up with the story. Her grandmother, Ruth, never spoke of Elijah Crane or the winter of starvation, but Anna found the old diary in a box of family papers when she was 16. She read Abigail Turner's words by flashlight under her covers, her heart pounding with fear and fascination. "We are hungry, but we are not afraid. He says we are chosen. He says we will never die." Anna read the diary over and over, trying to understand how a whole town could have followed a stranger into darkness. She wondered what had really happened to Elijah Crane and why her grandmother had stayed silent for so many years. When Anna turned 25, she decided to return to Mill Hollow. She wanted to see the place for herself, to walk the empty streets, to find the graves and the church and the house where Abigail had written her diary. She wanted to know if the past could ever truly be buried. The journey begins. Anna packed a small bag and set out on a bright spring morning. The road to Mill Hollow was rough and overgrown, but she followed the directions in Abigail's diary using landmarks that had survived the years. The old stone bridge, the willow tree by the river, the bend in the road where the wildflowers grew. As she walked, Anna thought about her grandmother, about the other survivors, about the children who had died. She wondered what she would find in the ruins of the village, and whether she would feel the same fear and hope that Abigail had described. The first sign of Mill Hollow was the church steeple, rising above the trees like a finger pointing to the sky. The building was crumbling, its windows broken, its doors hanging open. Anna stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The altar was still there, though the cross had fallen. Anna knelt and whispered a prayer for the lost, for the hungry, for the ones who had believed. She found the spot where Abigail's diary had been left, and for a moment, she felt as if she could hear the voices of the past, soft, desperate, full of longing. The village of ghosts. Anna spent the day exploring the ruins. The houses were empty, their roofs caved in, their walls covered in moss and ivy. She found the old boarding house where Abigail had lived, and the barn where Samuel Price had hidden food for his family. In the graveyard behind the church, Anna found rows of stones, some with names, most with only dates or simple crosses. She knelt by the grave marked Ruth Collins, her own grandmother, and left a wildflower on the stone. As the sun set, Anna sat on the steps of the church, reading Abigail's diary one more time. She felt a strange sense of peace, as if the village was finally at rest. But as darkness fell, Anna heard a sound, a soft, shuffling step, like someone walking through the grass. She stood, her heart pounding, and saw a figure moving among the graves, a stranger in the night. The figure was an old man, his hair white, his back bent. He carried a lantern and moved slowly, stopping at each grave to whisper a prayer. Anna watched from the shadows, unsure whether to speak. Finally, the man turned and saw her. He raised his lantern, his eyes bright in the darkness. "You're not from here," he said, his voice gentle. Anna shook her head. "My name is Anna Collins. My grandmother was Ruth. I came to see the village." The old man nodded. "I remember Ruth. She was a good woman. I'm Thomas Finch. My father was the schoolmaster here." Anna stepped forward, relief flooding her chest. "I've read Abigail Turner's diary. I wanted to understand what happened." Thomas sighed. "No one ever really understood. We were all so hungry for hope, for meaning, for something to believe in. Elijah gave us that for a while, but it cost us everything." They sat together on the church steps, sharing stories of the past. Thomas told Anna about the days before Elijah came, about the laughter and the music and the way the village had once felt alive. "He took that from us," Thomas said, "but we let him. We wanted to believe that suffering could make us holy. We wanted to believe that hunger could save us." Anna nodded, her eyes full of tears. "Do you think the village is cursed?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I think it's just sad. But sadness isn't a curse. It's a memory, and memories can be healed." The secret in the woods. The next morning, Thomas offered to show Anna something he had never shown anyone else. He led her into the woods behind the village, following a narrow path through the trees. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. After a while, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a small stone marker, covered in moss. "This is where Elijah is buried," Thomas said. "He died in the last days, when the hunger was too much even for him. Some of the men buried him here, away from the others. They didn't want his grave in the churchyard." Anna knelt by the stone, tracing the letters carved into the rock. Ike 1873. She felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Elijah had caused so much pain, but he had also been a man, lost, hungry, searching for something he could never find. Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder. "We all have our ghosts, Anna, but we don't have to let them rule us." A new beginning. Anna spent a week in Mill Hollow, cleaning the graves, repairing the church door, and writing in her own journal. She felt a sense of connection to the past, to Abigail, to her grandmother, to all the people who had suffered and survived. Before she left, Anna planted a tree in the center of the village, a young oak, strong and full of life. She tied a ribbon to its branches, a symbol of hope for the future. As she walked away, Anna looked back at the village one last time. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the ruins. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that the story of Mill Hollow would not be forgotten. The diary's legacy. When Anna returned to Ashford, she shared her story with her family, her friends, and anyone who would listen. She published Abigail's diary along with her own journal, and the book became a source of comfort and inspiration for people who had suffered their own losses. The story of Mill Hollow spread across the country, reminding people of the dangers of blind faith, the power of doubt, and the importance of remembering the past. Anna started a foundation in her grandmother's name, dedicated to helping communities heal from trauma and loss. She traveled to other towns, listening to their stories, planting trees, and teaching people how to honor their memories without being trapped by them. A village remembered. Every year, on the anniversary of the fasting cult's end, Anna returned to Mill Hollow. She brought flowers for the graves, read from Abigail's diary, and sat in the church, listening to the wind in the trees. Sometimes other descendants joined her, children and grandchildren of the survivors, each carrying their own stories, their own memories, their own hopes. Together they kept the memory of Mill Hollow alive, not as a place of horror, but as a place of healing. And as the years passed, the village slowly came back to life. Wildflowers grew in the fields, birds nested in the trees, and the old church bell rang once more, calling the living and the dead to remember, to forgive, and to hope. But as Anna and the others worked to heal the wounds of the past, a final secret remains, one last truth hidden in the diary waiting to be discovered. What really happened in the final days of Mill Hollow, and what message did Abigail leave for the future? The next chapter will reveal the last entry in the diary and the answer that will echo for generations. Stay with me. The last entry. The spring after Anna's return to Mill Hollow was the brightest the village had seen in decades. The wildflowers she'd planted around the new oak tree bloomed in a riot of color, and the air was filled with the songs of birds and the hum of bees. For the first time in living memory, the village felt alive, not haunted but hopeful. Anna spent her days tending the graves, repairing the church, and writing letters to the other descendants of Mill Hollow. She invited them to visit, to see the place where their ancestors had lived and died, to share their stories and their hopes for the future. One afternoon, as Anna was cleaning the church, she found something she had missed before, a loose stone in the wall behind the altar. Curious, she pried it free and discovered a small, leather-bound book, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a faded ribbon. Her hands trembling, Anna opened the book. It was Abigail Turner's diary, but not the one she had read as a girl. This was a second volume, written in the final days of the fasting cult, hidden away in the hope that someone, someday, would find it. The diary's final days. Anna sat in the sunlight, turning the fragile pages with care. Abigail's handwriting was shaky, but her words were clear and urgent. The hunger is worse than ever. The children cry at night, and the old ones do not wake in the morning. Elijah says we are close, that the suffering will end soon. But I see the fear in his eyes. He is not the man he was. He is thinner, weaker, haunted by dreams he will not share. Abigail wrote of the growing unrest in the village. More and more people were questioning Elijah's teachings, whispering about leaving, about finding food, about saving their children. But Elijah's most loyal followers watched everyone reporting any sign of doubt. Samuel and Mary are gone. I do not know if they made it. Ruth comes to me at night begging for forgiveness. She says she was wrong, that she should have listened to her heart, not her fear. Abigail described the final days in heartbreaking detail, the empty houses, the silent streets, the funerals that no one had the strength to attend. I am so tired. I do not know how much longer I can write. But I must. Someone must remember. Someone must know that we tried, that we were not all lost. A message for the future. As Anna read, she realized that Abigail had written the last pages of the diary not for herself, but for the future. If you are reading this, you are the hope I prayed for. You are the proof that the world did not end here. Please do not let our story be forgotten. Tell the truth. Remember the names of the lost. Forgive those who were afraid, and never ever let hunger be called holy again. Abigail's final entry was a prayer. May the world be kinder to you than it was to us. May you find peace where we found only pain. May you remember us, not as fools, but as people who wanted to believe in something better. Anna closed the diary, tears streaming down her face. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that Abigail's words had finally reached someone who could understand. A gathering of descendants. Anna wrote to the other descendants, telling them about the diary and inviting them to Mill Hollow for a memorial service. She wanted to honor the lost, to share Abigail's message, to bring closure to a story that had haunted their families for generations. On a warm summer day, people began to arrive, some alone, some with children and grandchildren, all carrying the weight of the past. They gathered in the church, filling the pews with laughter and tears, sharing stories of their ancestors and the lives they had built after leaving Mill Hollow. Anna read from Abigail's diary, her voice steady and clear. We are hungry, but we are not afraid. He says we are chosen. He says we will never die. She paused, looking out at the faces of the descendants. But we did not die. We survived. We built new lives. We found hope. The crowd stood in silence, honoring the memory of the lost and the courage of those who had survived. The power of forgiveness. After the service, the descendants walked to the graveyard, leaving flowers on the stones and reading the names aloud. They forgave the past, forgave Elijah, forgave themselves. Ruth's granddaughter, Sarah, knelt by her grandmother's grave and whispered a prayer for forgiveness and peace. Samuel's grandson, David, placed a loaf of bread on the grave of a child he had never met, a symbol of the life that had been denied to so many. Anna planted a new wildflower by Abigail's grave, promising to keep her story alive. A village reborn. As the sun set, the descendants gathered around the oak tree in the center of the village. They shared a meal, simple bread, cheese, and fruit, breaking the fast that had once destroyed their families. They laughed, They cried, they remembered. For the first time in more than a century, Mill Hollow was filled with life. Anna looked around at the faces of the people she had come to love, and she knew that the village was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a place of healing, of hope, of new beginnings. The diary's legacy. Anna decided to publish Abigail's diary along with her own journal and the stories of the other descendants. The book became a source of comfort and inspiration for people who had suffered their own losses, who had struggled with faith, who had searched for meaning in a world that often seemed cruel. The story of Mill Hollow spread across the country, reminding people of the dangers of blind faith, the power of doubt, and the importance of remembering the past. Anna started a foundation in Abigail's name, dedicated to helping communities heal from trauma and loss. She traveled to other towns, listening to their stories, planting trees, and teaching people how to honor their memories without being trapped to them. A promise kept. Every year, on the anniversary of the fasting cult's end, Anna and the other descendants returned to Mill Hollow. They brought flowers for the graves, read from Abigail's diary, and sat in the church, listening to the wind in the trees. Sometimes other descendants joined them, children and grandchildren of the survivors, each carrying their own stories, their own memories, their own hopes. Together they kept the memory of Mill Hollow alive, not as a place of horror, but as a place of healing. And as the years passed, the village slowly came back to life. Wildflowers grew in the fields, birds nested in the trees, and the old church bell rang once more, calling the living and the dead to remember, to forgive, and to hope. But as Anna and the others look to the future, a final question remains, one that will echo through generations. What does it truly mean to forgive, and how do we ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated? The next chapter will reveal the ultimate lesson of Mill Hollow and the hope that endures beyond every shadow. Stay with me. The lesson of forgiveness. The years after the memorial service in Mill Hollow were some of the most peaceful the village had ever known. The wildflowers Anna and the other descendants planted grew into a sea of color each spring, and the oak tree in the center of the village became a symbol of hope and renewal. The church, once a place of sorrow, was now filled with laughter and music whenever the descendants returned. But even as the village healed, the question that haunted Anna and the others remained. What does it truly mean to forgive? And how do you make sure the mistakes of the past are never repeated? A new generation's questions. Anna's daughter, Lily, was the first to ask the question out loud. She was 12 years old, curious and bright, with her mother's eyes and her great-grandmother Ruth's stubbornness. "Mom," she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, "do you really forgive Elijah Crane? Do you forgive the people who followed him?" Anna looked at her daughter, searching for the right words. "I think forgiveness is complicated, Lily. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It means letting go of the anger so it doesn't poison your heart. It means choosing to move forward, even when it's hard." Lily frowned. "But what if someone does something really terrible? What if they hurt people on purpose?" Anna nodded. "That's the hardest kind of forgiveness. But sometimes forgiving isn't about the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the pain." Lily was quiet for a long time. "I think I understand. But I don't think I could ever forgive someone like Elijah." Anna hugged her daughter. "You don't have to. Not right away. Maybe not ever. But you can choose not to let his actions define your life." The foundation's work, the Abigail Turner Foundation, started by Anna and the other descendants, grew into a national organization. They help communities heal from trauma, taught workshops on resilience and forgiveness, and provided support for people who had suffered at the hands of cults or abusive leaders. Anna traveled the country, speaking at schools, churches, and conferences. She told the story of Mill Hollow, of the hunger and the hope, of the mistakes and the miracles. She read from Abigail's diary, sharing the words that had saved her family and her village. If you are reading this, you are the hope I prayed for. You are the proof that the world did not end here. Please do not let our story be forgotten. Tell the truth. Remember the names of the lost. Forgive those who are afraid. And never ever let hunger be called holy again. People listened. They cried. They shared their own stories. And slowly, the world began to change. A visit from the past. One autumn, as the leaves turned gold and red, Anna received a letter from a man named Jacob Crane. He was a distant relative of Elijah, living in another state. He had read Anna's book and wanted to visit Mill Hollow. Anna was nervous. She didn't know what to expect. Would Jacob defend his ancestor? Would he ask for forgiveness? Would he bring old wounds back to the surface? When Jacob arrived, he was quiet and respectful. He walked the village with Anna, visiting the graves, sitting in the church, listening to the wind in the trees. "I'm sorry for what my family did," he said at last. "I grew up hearing stories about Elijah, but I never knew the truth. I want to help. I want to make things right." Anna smiled. "You already have, just by being here, by listening, by caring." Jacob donated money to the foundation, helped plant new trees in the village, and became a friend to the descendants. His presence was a reminder that the past could be healed, that forgiveness could bridge even the deepest divides. The power of story. As the years passed, the story of Mill Hollow became a lesson taught in schools and churches across the country. Teachers used Abigail's diary to teach about history, psychology, and the dangers of blind faith. Pastors preached about the importance of questioning authority, of caring for the vulnerable, of choosing love over fear. Anna and the other descendants continued to return to Mill Hollow every year, bringing their children and grandchildren, sharing stories around the oak tree, lighting candles in the church, and reading the names of the lost. Lily grew up, went to college, and became a writer. She published her own book about Mill Hollow, weaving together the stories of her family, the lessons of forgiveness, and the hope that had grown from so much pain. A village transformed. Mill Hollow, once a place of tragedy, became a place of pilgrimage. People came from all over the world to see the wildflowers, to sit under the oak tree, to read the names in the churchyard. They came to remember, to mourn, to heal. The village was never rebuilt, but it was never forgotten. The ruins of the old houses, the stones in the graveyard, the diary in the church, all became part of a living memory, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of the human spirit. Anna, now an old woman, sat on the steps of the church one evening, watching the sun set over the fields. She thought of Abigail, of Ruth, of Samuel and Mary, of all the people who had suffered and survived. She thought of Elijah Crane and wondered if he had ever found peace. The final lesson. As darkness fell, Anna gathered her family and the other descendants in the church. She read the last entry from Abigail's diary, her voice steady and clear. "May the world be kinder to you than it was to us. May you find peace where we found only pain. May you remember us, not as fools, but as people who wanted to believe in something better." She looked at her family, at the children and grandchildren, who had never known hunger, who had never been afraid to ask questions, who had grown up in a world shaped by the lessons of Mill Hollow. "We are the proof that forgiveness is possible," Anna said. We are the proof that the past does not have to define the future. We are the hope that Abigail prayed for. The family lit candles, sang songs, and promised to keep the story alive for another generation, or a world changed. The story of Mill Hollow became a beacon for people everywhere who had suffered, who had lost, who had struggled to forgive. The Abigail Turner Foundation helped thousands of people find hope and healing. The wildflowers in the village bloomed brighter every year. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled the leaves and the sun set over the fields, Anna knew that the light of forgiveness would never go out. But as Anna's life draws to a close, a final question remains, one that only the next generation can answer. How do you carry the lessons of the past into a world that is always changing? The next chapter will reveal the future of Mill Hollow and the hope that endures beyond every shadow. Stay with me. The Seeds of Tomorrow. The years had been kind to Mill Hollow in their own quiet way. The wildflowers Anna and the other descendants had planted now covered the fields in a riot of color every spring. The oak tree in the center of the village, once a sapling, now spread its branches wide, sheltering the church and the old graveyard in its shade. The ruins of the houses, left as they were, had become part of the landscape, silent witnesses to a story that was no longer just about loss, but about healing. Anna, now in her 80s, felt the weight of time in her bones, but the lightness of hope in her heart. She had spent her life tending to the memory of Mill Hollow, making sure that the story of the fasting cult was never forgotten, but also never allowed to define the village's future. She had watched her daughter Lily grow into a woman of strength and compassion, and she had seen the children and grandchildren of other survivors return to the village year after year to honor the past and dream of what might come next. But as Anna's health began to fail, she knew it was time to pass the torch. The question that haunted her was simple but profound. How do you carry the lessons of the past into a world that is always changing? A final gathering. It was a warm day in late spring when Anna called her family and the other descendants to Mill Hollow for what she knew would be her last gathering. The air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers, and the sun shone through the leaves of the great oak tree, dappling the ground with gold. Lily arrived first, her arms full of fresh bread and fruit. She was followed by her cousins, her children, and the children of her friends, dozens of people, all bound together by the story of Mill Hollow. They gathered in the church, now restored and filled with light. Anna sat at the front, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes bright with anticipation. "I want to tell you a story," she began, her voice soft but clear. "It's a story you all know, but it's also a story that belongs to the world now. It's the story of Mill Hollow, of hunger and hope, of mistakes and forgiveness. It's the story of how we learn to remember without being trapped by the past." She spoke of Abigail Turner, of Elijah Crane, of the winter of starvation and the spring of healing. She spoke of the wildflowers, the oak tree, and the diary that had saved them all. "But most of all," Anna said, "it's a story about what comes next, about how you take the lessons of the past and use them to build something better." The next generation speaks. After Anna finished, Lily stood and addressed the gathering. "We are the children and grandchildren of Mill Hollow," she said. "We carry the memory of what happened here, but we also carry the hope of what can be. We have learned that forgiveness is not just about letting go of anger, but about choosing to love, to help, to heal." Lily's daughter, Grace, just 10 years old, stepped forward shyly. "I want to plant more flowers," she said. I want to make the village beautiful for everyone who comes here." The crowd laughed and applauded, and soon the children were running through the fields, scattering seeds and laughter in their wake. A new mission. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned pink and gold, Anna sat with Lily on the steps of the church. "I'm proud of you," Anna said. "You've made Mill Hollow a place of hope." Lily squeezed her mother's hand. "You showed us how. But what if people forget? What if the world changes so much that no one remembers what happened here?" Anna smiled. "The world will always change, Lily. But as long as there are people who care, who tell the story, who plant flowers and light candles and forgive, the memory will never die. It will grow, just like the wildflowers." Lily nodded, tears in her eyes. "I promise I'll keep telling the story. I'll make sure Grace and her friends know what happened here and why it matters." Anna hugged her daughter, feeling a deep sense of peace. The last lesson. As night fell, the family and their friends gathered around a bonfire in the center of the village. They sang songs, told stories, and roasted bread over the flames. The children chased fireflies, their laughter echoing through the fields. Anna watched them, her heart full. She thought of Abigail Turner, of Ruth Collins, of Samuel Price and Mary, and all the others who had suffered and survived. She thought of Elijah Crane, and wondered if he had ever found forgiveness. When the fire burned low, Anna asked for silence. "I want to leave you with one last lesson," she said. "Forgiveness is not a single act. It's a way of living. It's choosing every day to let go of anger, to help those who are hurting, to remember the past, but not be trapped by it. It's planting flowers where there was once only sorrow." She looked at Grace, at Lily, at all the faces shining in the firelight. "You are the seeds of tomorrow. Make the world kinder than the one you inherited. And never, ever let hunger of any kind be called holy again. A promise for the future." Anna died peacefully that summer, surrounded by her family and friends. Her funeral was held in the church she had helped restore, and her grave was marked with wildflowers and a simple stone that read, "She remembered, she forgave, she hoped." Lily and the other descendants kept their promise. Every year they returned to Mill Hollow, planting new flowers, telling new stories, and welcoming anyone who needed a place to heal. The Abigail Turner Foundation continued its work, helping communities across the country recover from trauma, teaching the lessons of Mill Hollow, and spreading the message of hope and forgiveness. Grace grew up to become a teacher, sharing the story of Mill Hollow with her students, helping them understand that the past is never truly gone, but it can be transformed. A world renewed. As the decades passed, Mill Hollow became a symbol of resilience and renewal. People came from all over the world to see the wildflowers, to sit under the oak tree, to read the names in the churchyard. They came to remember, to mourn, to heal. The village was never rebuilt, but it was never forgotten. The ruins of the old houses, the stones in the graveyard, the diary in the church, all became part of a living memory, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of the human spirit. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled the leaves and the sun set over the fields, Lily and Grace and all the others who carried the story of Mill Hollow would smile, knowing that the seeds of tomorrow had been planted, and that the light of hope would never go out. But as the world moves forward, a final question remains, one that every generation must answer for itself. How do you keep hope alive in a world that is always changing? The next chapter will reveal the enduring legacy of Mill Hollow and the hope that endures beyond every shadow. Stay with me. The enduring light. The world outside Mill Hollow changed in ways the villagers could never have imagined. Cities grew, technology advanced, and the old stories faded into the background noise of modern life. But in the heart of the valley, where wildflowers still bloomed and the oak tree still stood, the memory of what happened in 1873 remained alive, carried by those who refused to let the past be forgotten. Lily, now the matriarch of her family, watched her daughter Grace grow into a woman of compassion and strength. The Abigail Turner Foundation thrived, helping communities across the country heal from trauma, teaching the lessons of Mill Hollow, and spreading the message of hope and forgiveness. But as the world moved forward, Lily found herself wondering, how do you keep hope alive in a world that is always changing? How do you make sure the light never goes out? A new generation's challenge. Grace, now a teacher, faced a classroom of children who had never known hunger, who had never heard of Elijah Crane or the fasting cult. She told them the story of Mill Hollow, of the wildflowers and the oak tree, of the diary that had saved a village. Some of the children listened with wide eyes, others with skepticism. One boy raised his hand. Why didn't they just leave, he asked. Why did they listen to Elijah? Grace smiled gently. Sometimes, when people are afraid or desperate, they look for someone to give them hope, even if it's the wrong kind of hope. That's why it's so important to ask questions, to think for yourself, and to help others when you can. Another girl asked, do you think something like that could happen again? Grace nodded. It's always possible. That's why we tell the story, so we remember what can happen when people stop listening to their hearts, when they let fear or hunger or loneliness make their choices for them. The Foundation's new mission. The Abigail Turner Foundation expanded its work, focusing not just on healing the wounds of the past, but on building resilience for the future. They started programs in schools, teaching children how to recognize manipulation, how to ask for help, how to support each other in times of crisis. They worked with communities recovering from disasters, helping them rebuild not just their homes, but their sense of hope and connection. Lily and Grace traveled together, speaking at conferences, leading workshops, and planting wildflowers in every town they visited. The flowers became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that beauty can grow even in the darkest places, a world in need of hope. As the years passed, the world faced new challenges: wars, pandemics, economic crises. People lost jobs, lost loved ones, lost faith in the future. But wherever the wildflowers of Mill Hollow grew, there was a sense of hope. People wrote letters to the foundation, sharing their own stories of loss and healing. Some had survived cults or abusive relationships. Others had lost everything in fires or floods. All found comfort in the story of Mill Hollow and the knowledge that they were not alone. One letter from a woman named Maria stood out to Grace. I lost my home in the hurricane. I thought I would never feel safe again. But then I read about Mill Hollow, about the wildflowers and the oak tree, about the people who found hope in the ashes. I planted wildflowers in my yard, and every time I see them bloom, I remember that I can start again. Grace read the letter aloud at the next family gathering, her voice trembling with emotion. The last gathering. Lily, now in her 70s, knew her time was drawing to a close. She called her family and the other descendants to Mill Hollow for one final gathering. They came from all over the country, bringing children and grandchildren, stories and songs, laughter and tears. They gathered under the oak tree, now massive and strong, its branches sheltering the church and the graveyard. The wildflowers bloomed in every color, a living tapestry of memory and hope. Lily stood before the crowd, her voice clear and strong. We are the children of Mill Hollow, she said. We carry the memory of what happened here, but we also carry the hope of what can be. We have learned that forgiveness is not just about letting go of anger, but about choosing to love, to help, to heal. We have learned that the past is never truly gone, but it does not have to define our future. She looked at Grace, at the children playing in the fields, at the faces of those who had come to remember. We are the seeds of tomorrow. Let us plant hope wherever we go. Let us tell the story, not just of what we lost, but of what we found, each other. A promise renewed. As the sun set, the family and their friends lit candles and placed them around the oak tree. They sang songs, told stories, and promised to keep the light of Mill Hollow burning for another generation. Grace hugged her mother, tears in her eyes. "I'll keep the promise," she whispered. "I'll make sure the story lives on." Lily smiled, her heart full. "I know you will." The enduring light. After Lily's passing, Grace took up the mantle of the foundation. She continued to teach, to write, to plant wildflowers in every place that needed hope. The story of Mill Hollow became a legend, a lesson, a beacon for anyone who had ever felt lost or alone. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled the leaves and the sun set over the fields, Grace would sit under the oak tree reading from Abigail's diary and know that the light would never go out. A world changed. The wildflowers of Mill Hollow spread across the country, carried by the hands of those who believed in hope. The oak tree became a symbol of resilience, its image printed on books, posters, and the walls of schools and hospitals. The Abigail Turner Foundation continued its work helping people heal, teaching the lessons of the past, and planting seeds for the future. And every year, on the anniversary of the fasting cult's end, people gathered in Mill Hollow to remember, to forgive, and to hope. The final lesson. As Grace grew old, she wrote her own diary, leaving a message for the next generation. The world will always change. There will always be darkness, always be loss. But there will also always be hope. As long as we remember, as long as we forgive, as long as we plant wildflowers and tell our stories, the light will never go out. And so the story of Mill Hollow lived on. A story of hunger and hope, of loss and forgiveness, of the enduring light that shines in every heart. If this story moved you, or if you believe in shining a light on hidden truths, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories to the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, never be afraid to plant hope, to forgive, and to keep the light burning. This is Sanctified Secrets, and we'll see you in the next story.